welcome everybody. So maybe we can do a kind of soft lead into this and people will still be coming along. But I can start talking a bit about what this session is and how it fits into the bigger schedule of sessions that we have planned for this autumn. So this is the first in a series of webinars um, produced in collaboration between GoGN and the Knowledge Equity Network. And what we wanted to do here was explore some of the issues and some of the terrain around things that we hold in common in our interests around education, around diversity, equity and inclusion, and around opportunity for education and the question of how do we extend that? How do we understand it? And so there's quite a lot of different stuff that will be coming up in the series. This first session is focused on theoretical perspectives, theoretical approaches, philosophical approaches, and the idea is that it can serve as a foundation for some of the other sessions, but also as a kind of toolkit for all of us to use when we're thinking and speaking about equity in ways that will be as precise and clear as possible, I suppose. So let's get started. People may still be drifting in, but I'm just going to introduce myself. So I'm Rob Farrow. I'm based at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University in the UK. By disciplinary background, I'm a philosopher and educational technologist. Some of the philosophy stuff is going to be explored today. I have various roles. So I'm co-chair of the ICDE Open Education Network with Christina Rancy. I'm also the co-director of GoGN, or the Global OER Graduate Network. And just to say a word briefly about GoGN. So GoGN is a network of support for research into open education, especially doctoral research into open education. And we have about 200 members who are either doctoral students or they've finished their doctorates, and about another 250 members who are experts, mentors, supervisors, and just people interested in open education research. And the network is free to join. You can see the URL on the slide right now, or you can follow the QR code and that will take you through to the registration page. And you can also learn more about the network there. And there's a whole bunch of openly licensed resources designed for use by researchers that you can tap into there. I'm just going to hand over to Antonio briefly to introduce himself and the Knowledge Equity Network.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everybody here. It's a pleasure to see you. This event is co-organized with the Knowledge Equity Network. My name is Antonio Martinez Arboleda. I'm professor in Open and Digital Education at the University of Leeds and one of the senior leads of the Knowledge Equity Network with my colleague Christina Rancy, who is also here. And we're pleased to introduce to all of you briefly the Knowledge Equity Network, a group of higher education institutions, international organizations, professionals who are committed to collaboration, open education, open research, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And our work stems around, focuses on trying to achieve, the objectives set by the Declaration of Knowledge Equity that was launched in April 2023. We want to make sure that our work goes beyond the debate, the discussion, the advisory role into concrete action. And we are supporting in different ways initiatives and projects in open education and open research. If you want to explore the Knowledge Equity Network Declaration, you're welcome to do so by looking at that QR. Our declaration is in several languages, and we would like to invite you to read it and sign and join this wonderful community. Thank you very much. And I give way now to my wonderful colleague, Beck Pitt.
Hiya, thanks so much, Antonio. Hi, everyone. It's so great to see you today. So, as I mentioned, as Antonio just mentioned, this is a collaboration between GoGN and the Knowledge Equity Network. My name is Beck Pitt. I'm co-director of GoGN with Rob Farrow. We're really delighted that you've joined us today, and we just wanted to quickly run through the upcoming sessions. So, I'm going to hand over to different colleagues in a moment, and then come back in at the end with a session coming up later in October. So yeah, it's really great to meet you all today. I'll hand over to Karina though, who's going to tell you a bit more about what sessions are coming up. Thanks, Karina.
Thanks, Beck and colleagues. Hi, everyone. Hello from Brazil. It's wonderful to be here. So thanks all for joining. My name is Karina Bossu, and I work with this amazing team in GoGN. And I look after the EDI strand, the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion strand. I'm also a senior lecturer, academic professional development at the Open University. If I could start with my session, Beck, and promote what because each of us are organizing sessions in this series, and mine will be on the 9th of October. And the work we are going to present. So the session is about implementing equity, diversity, and inclusion practices in open education. This is a very well connected to the work we've been doing in GoGN, where we have investigated, EDI in different parts of the world. Now we are moving on to identify aspects we can implement. There is a lineup of amazing speakers there. And we will try to see some of the research you have been doing and others have been doing in that space into practice. So there will be some, hopefully, recommendations to put things into practice there. So I would welcome you guys to that session. I'll be chairing that. But it's great to be here. Thanks again. And I will pass on back to you, Beck.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Karina. Thanks so much. And
thanks.
Chrissy as well now. I think we've got Chrissy on the call just to say hello, introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about some of the sessions as well here. Thanks so much, Chrissy.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you all, and thank you for joining us. Hi, Karina in Brazil. I'm in exotic UK at the moment. So yes, we are delighted that we have joined up with GoGN. I myself am a proud GoGN alumna, and I've benefited from the community. And I hope if you are new to open education, if you are a doctoral researcher, that you will be joining GoGN too. I'll be facilitating the session we are organizing on the 16th of October, and it is all about community equity and resilience. And I'm delighted that we have Vasiliki Kupi from Leeds with us and Dafatsa Mushonga from Pretoria, with both of whom I worked very closely, and they will be discussing with us that important topic through an application, through an open educational initiative we led in collaboration with Pretoria around social justice spaces for change. So I'm very much looking forward, and I hope all of you and others you may know will be joining us. Thank you. I'm based in Leeds in the School of Education. Back to you, Beck. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. That's great. So we've got some awesome sessions coming up. Please do join us. There are some additional ones. This is a 6-session series. So we do have a further 2 sessions coming up, one of which will be on equity, solidarity and resistance, voices from across the open education space, which will be around in a month's time as well. So keep a lookout for that and more information on the remaining sessions coming soon. But yeah, it's wonderful to have you all with us today. And I'll hand back now to Rob to continue the discussion. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Beck and colleagues. Yes, it's a very exciting collaboration, and it's good for us to get the ball rolling after all the discussions that we've had about the kind of things that we could discuss in this series. So I just wanted to give you a quick rundown of what's going to happen in the next sort of 50 minutes or so. So we're going to have a 50-minute So to start with, I'm going to present and I'm going to talk about equity from different perspectives and different philosophical perspectives. And the goal here is not to make everything into a philosophical discussion. It's not to try and have the answers to the problem of educational equity because I don't have those answers. I'm not sure that anybody has those answers. But I think that concepts can be useful to help us think as clearly as possible about these things. So I'm going to start off. I mean, where do you start off talking about this stuff? I'm going to start off with an image that I'm sure you've seen or you've seen a version of somewhere because it's a very popular way of trying to explain the difference between equality and equity. But what I want to kind of use it in as a kind of artifact for us to reflect around and to explore a critique that was made by a philosophy professor of this meme in a blog post earlier this year, I think it was. And that's going to lead into a kind of consideration of different ways of conceptualizing equity, different theories of justice. Because ultimately, when we talk about equity, we're talking about fairness of a sort. We're talking about justice of a sort. And how you understand concepts like fairness and justice can have implications for how you understand equity. I also want to touch on just the idea of skepticism about equity, the idea that it's not a realistic thing for us to achieve. Um, I've got some sympathy for the view. As I present it, you'll see kind of how that looks. I've got some sympathy for that, but I'm less fatalistic about it. I want to talk a bit about how open education can align to concepts of equity and how you can articulate it in a kind of explicit way. Sometimes it's quite implicit. We're then going to have a response to what I've presented from my colleague at the Open University in the UK, that's Professor Azuma Dennis. And then we'll go into a more general discussion at the end, which is open to everybody to participate in. While I'm presenting, I can't see the chat or the Q&A. So forgive me if you're trying to get my attention there and you can't. But if it's pressing and, maybe a member of the team can interrupt me and just jump in. But let's get started. So I'm sure you've seen this or some version of this somewhere before. There are literally hundreds of variations on this graphic. And the fundamental reason for it is to illustrate two different ways of thinking about equality and equity. Obviously, you can see or understand equity and equality as the same thing, and sometimes they do mean the same thing. So the meme is largely used to elucidate the difference between equality and equity. So essentially, equality is a version of treating people all the same, treat people the same way. And it's normally distinguished between equity or equitable treatment, which would be something like fair treatment for people based on their individual context and circumstances. And it's not to say that one of these is necessarily better than the other. And I think sometimes equality is the appropriate thing to focus on. But when we talk about equity, especially in an educational context, we often are sort of pointing to the inadequacy of just treating everybody the same, because people need different things. They've got, differences between them. So just to try and sort of unpick this distinction between equality and equity here, you can think of it as a way of distributing resources. So in the graphic, you have boxes that people are standing on, and if you just give everyone one box, then it's okay for the taller people. They can see over the fence and they can see the baseball game. But some people need more than one box. And so we adjust the allocation of resources based on what people need. And that is an equitable form of treatment. So to give an example of how that looks, it might be the difference between everybody receiving a grant to go and study somewhere versus the amount in the grant is different based on your pre-existing access to resources. So if you're from a wealthy background, you don't get as much of a grant as someone from a poorer background. So it's adjusted for fairness. Another way of understanding this difference is to say, well, um, if we just give everybody one box, we're treating everybody the same. We're completely blind to the differences between them, and that can be, perfectly justified. So, for instance, it might be to use the example here, everybody pays the same amount of tax on something, um, or it might be that the law applies equally to everybody, or something like that. So there are forms of universal treatment which perfectly justifiable. But in this case, from the equitable perspective, it's saying that doesn't really work. It's not really fair to treat people all the same. You've got to take into account these differences. So really, it's a difference between a sort of universal approach where the rules apply to everybody equally, and a contextualist approach where, depending on your circumstances, the strategy used is different. And another way of thinking of this is you could say, well, from the equality perspective, it's all about giving people the same stuff, right? There could be the same resources or whatever. Whereas the equity side is a bit more focused on the outcomes. So what kind of adjustments do you need to make to level the playing field, to bring everyone up to the same ability to participate in something? So with that in mind, let's think a bit about the meme as a kind of metaphor. And metaphors can be very useful, but they can illuminate but also obscure. And in this case, I think some of the questions that I have thinking about this metaphor include things like, what are these boxes supposed to represent? And when we collect the boxes and redistribute them, what's happening there? It's a metaphor, right? But what's it a metaphor for? What do the boxes stand for? Similarly, what does the fence stand for? Is it a kind of systematic barrier? Is it an economic barrier, a cultural barrier, something to do with a level of awareness? It can mean lots of different things depending on how we're applying it. The measure of success in the meme is something like, can people see over the fence? And in that case, you might say, well, what is that threshold of being able to see over the fence, which seems to be something like the minimum criteria for successful participation? What does it mean? What are the different heights of the people mean? What do they represent? I think you could also say, what is it that they're trying to access here? It's a baseball game in most of the versions of the meme. But are they just trying to see the game? Is that the end of the aspiration here? Because they don't seem to have a lot of agency in these memes, and they're kind of passively observing whatever happens. Maybe there's a version of this where they're actually playing baseball. I haven't seen that version if it exists. Here's someone riffing on the meme to say, actually, yeah, you've got equality, you've got equitable treatment here described as justice. But really what you're trying to do is remove the fence completely, remove the structural barriers completely. And I wonder if, I like the vibe, right? I like the kind of like Freudian flavor to that. But it doesn't seem to me necessarily realistic that you can remove all barriers completely, not without understanding them a bit better. And maybe it's the kind of wholesale social change that would be needed to actually have equitable relations. Here's another one here, similar thing. In this case, very similar to the one before. And there's versions of this where that final panel is blank and people are invited to fill it in and tell us what happens in, after a state of liberation. So it's a really influential meme, and partly because it communicates something very effectively. But maybe it also obscures important things as well. There's this blog post by a Canadian philosopher called Joseph Heath, and he writes about this meme with a certain degree of frustration. And some of the stuff that I'm going to say is partly based on this blog post, but I don't agree with everything that's in there. But essentially, what Heath says is, look, the thing about this meme is that it basically ignores the last 50 years of philosophical discussion about this kind of stuff and about what it means to have a sense of equity and how to understand equity and opportunity. And so there's a few different things here. I'm not going to go through it all in like great detail, but one thing that he says is there's really a sort of false distinction here between the uh, equality of ability to participate and equality of outcome. And he interprets the adjusted boxes as an outcome and says this opportunity versus outcome distinction is the thing that was, that people have moved on from in philosophy. And he also says, which I think is quite an interesting point, if you look at the literature around equity, diversity, and inclusion, it doesn't really tend to include any philosophy, and vice versa. Philosophers don't really engage with the discourse around EDI. And that's an interesting thing, which I think maybe we could do better around, and we could kind of maybe engage around a bit better. Another thing that Heath says is that this is just a very limited idea about what it means to try to practice equity, because it's just this idea of distributing boxes. And so your only job is to distribute the boxes in the right way, and then you've achieved some sort of equitable scenario. He also, invites us to, I guess, sort of reflect a bit more on kind of what is being equalized in here. It's not opportunity and outcome distinctions. He thinks that this was basically solved by John Rawls. I'll talk about Rawls in a second. And another kind of limitation of the meme is that there's only a certain number of boxes, and if you want to give someone a box, it means taking someone else's box away. Whereas a lot of the time, opportunities don't work like that. It doesn't necessarily cost you something to afford someone else an opportunity. And I think open educational resources are a good example of this, right? Because you can share them without them being denied to somebody else. And the final point that I want to pick up on from Heath's post is around relational equity. So if you just think about this in terms of it being a distribution problem, how do we distribute the boxes, whatever you think the boxes mean, whether it's resources or money or opportunities or cultures or whatever it might be, that doesn't really accommodate relational equity, which we'll come onto in a bit, but it's really the idea that what we really need to change is the way that people relate to each other, not what kind of resources are distributed. But some of this is kind of philosophy speak around the distributive justice stuff. And just to go back to John Rawls, and this book, A Theory of Justice, is a massively influential work in liberal philosophy. What Rawls essentially says, and really his target here is utilitarianism. And utilitarianism, oversimplified, is the ethical philosophy which says the right thing to do is the thing that brings around about the greatest utility for the greatest number of people. Sometimes it's put in terms of the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people, but pleasure there means something quite specific rather than just psychological pleasure. And so really what Rawls is saying here is like, we can't really take this as a realistic way of doing social critique or organizing society. Essentially, what we need to do is recognize that people start from different places and they have different projections for their life. They've got different things that they like or are interested in or that have meaning for them or these kind of things. And where he ends up with this is to say, what we really need to do to address inequality is to arrange our affairs in such a way that has the greatest benefit to those that are most disadvantaged or least advantaged. And this is the essence of what Heath is saying about this meme, is that it's like it ignores rules essentially, which obviously you're free to do, but there's sort of depth there that I'm going to try and explore in the next few slides. There's also this question around autonomy in Rawls, like what difference does it make if people are actually able to exercise their autonomy rather than just be given more boxes. Rawls ends up with the idea that we need to put most of our attention into the designing social institutions and the way they work to improve them and make them fairer. Following on from rules, there's this subsequent idea which is known as luck egalitarianism. Although I've put Dworkin's name next to it, but he never really embraced this label. But this gives you a flavor of where philosophy kind of goes in at least in the analytic tradition of philosophy in the 1970s and 80s. Everyone starts from a different place in life, and equity can be understood as the fairer distribution of opportunities. But the idea isn't necessarily to equalize everything, certainly not to equalize outcomes, because people make choices as well. And so the idea ends up being that we should do things that help people where it's just what's called brute bad luck or things that happen to you. So things you didn't have a choice about. So it could be that you were born with or develop a disability, or you come from a very poor background. And so then the luck egalitarian might say something like, you need to be given some support, you need to be given help with your learning or assistive technologies or something like that. And that would be a kind of legitimate use of this approach. However, if it's just that you are a particularly degenerate person who refuses to study or just never really does any work or something like that, then your bad outcome is not something that there's a moral obligation to compensate for. So it ends up being not so much about the resources or the outcome, but how you distribute opportunities or equal access to advantage. And so that's considered to be the fair thing, not necessarily an equitable outcome. Another variation on this, it comes from Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And this is really a similar kind of idea where basically, okay, in life there are, there's a natural world of resources, there's things that you can interact with, but it kind of accommodates all kinds of different life choices, what you value, what you consider to be important. And then from there, you essentially develop a kind of independent personal sense of well-being or utility that kind of is the thing that gives meaning to your life, something like that. Sen is more interested in evaluating what people do. Nussbaum is more interested in a kind of normative idea about how you should live, and this being a kind of formal expression of that. So those are some of the kind of philosophical moves that get made around equity coming off from rules. And this is a persistent way of framing educational equity. So this is from the OECD report from just before the pandemic. And you can see this definition here. Equity does not mean that all students obtain equal education outcomes, but rather that differences in student outcomes are unrelated to their background or to economic and social circumstances over which the students have no control. So that's basically luck egalitarianism, I would say. And to me, that seems to be a fairly sort of prominent concept in a lot of the high-level discourse that you might get from places like OECD, where it's not necessarily about outcomes or final outcomes. It's about how you extend opportunity to the right people in as many different circumstances as possible. And by right people, I just mean appropriate for that form. And this is, something that open education is very much focused on. So obviously we could talk more about that kind of like egalitarianism versus the kind of equality and equity meme. I just want to outline a few different theories of justice, which I guess there are some tensions between. There's also some compatibilities. And essentially, by giving a rundown of these, I'm hoping to show how there could be like how you can see where the tensions might arise from in different concepts of equity. So the first one I've been talking about, really, I guess, which is about how we move around the boxes, could be considered a form of redistributive justice. So I've given Rawls and Marx as examples of this. And under this view, it is just a question of how do we move the boxes? What's the right distribution of the boxes? We can redefine what the boxes mean, but essentially they always have some sort of like material quality. They're grounded in some sort of thing that's being moved around. But we could ask whether or not that's appropriate, because are all these things matters of what gets moved around? Aren't there kind of other things in the picture? Another theory is this idea of recognitive justice. And here, justice is understood as about recognizing and respecting individuals, groups, cultures, and sort of meeting them on their own terms. And this is, a view that I've been quite interested in. I did some of my graduate work on recognition. Um, but one problem that it kind of raises is whether or not you're supposed to recognize all cultures equally. And that might sound like a politically incorrect thing to say, but some cultures are problematic from the point of view of recognizing the dignity of others. So if you have a very misogynistic religious group, for instance, do we have to extend recognition to them? If they say we don't wish to educate any women, do we respect that? Do we recognize that as a valid point of view? There are political points of view which are similar. There are discriminatory political perspectives. Do we have to recognize all of those? Or do we go into those things with already having an idea about what is and isn't an acceptable form of culture? Because that doesn't sound like the recognition paradigm. It sounds like non-recognition. Um, or at least you're introducing a criteria other than just this culture believes this. Another way of looking at this stuff is to say justice is about representation and essentially it's about process. So we don't necessarily decide where the boxes land. We decide on the process of deciding how the boxes are allocated. And so I've given Habermas as my example here, but there are quite a few others where really essentially the idea is how do we make sure that everyone's involved in processes where decisions get made? If we can make the processes fair, does that mean the outcomes will also be fair? So it's a bit abstract, right? Talking about it in these ways, and I'm going to try to put some flesh on the bones. Here, it's worth just pointing out that you can align yourself to more than one of these at once, and indeed, many political philosophers do align themselves to multiple versions of this, or find compatible versions and ways of putting them together. Here I've drawn on Nancy Fraser's model, which combines redistributive, recognitive, and representative forms of justice. And here you can see that for each of those, we have a sense of what it might mean to be just, what injustice looks like, and a sense of how this idea of justice informs a particular approach towards educational equity. So, from a redistributive approach, we might look at how the funding is allocated, who gets a scholarship, who gets access to educational resources, who accesses tuition, all those kinds of things. From a recognition point of view, we might think about who's included, who writes the curriculum, how do we afford the appropriate forms of cultural recognition? How do we recognize cultural difference? How do we cultivate a sense of respect for diversity and for cultures other than our own? From the representative point of view, it's really grounded in a sense of, usually democratic process. How do we encourage participation? How do we make sure that marginalized people are heard and that they are able to be part of the appropriate political processes? So all of these things, I think you can see how they relate to different kind of educational scenarios. There's another couple that I wanted to mention, and I don't mean to sort of imply that these are necessarily equal things or that any of them are kind of better than the other. I'm just trying to say, like, here's a range of different ways of looking at stuff. Epistemic approaches to justice, in some ways, are the most interesting ones, but maybe also the most nebulous or hard to kind of get hold of sometimes. Because here the idea is we need to completely unpick all of our epistemic systems because they reflect problematic power relationships of the past. I'm going to say a bit more about these in a second. But obviously, there's a big thrust of decolonial literature, which is very directly focused on educational equity and will kind of essentially critique some of the things that I've already been saying and saying, well, these are just products of Western liberalism, capitalism, colonialism. And I think we should take these seriously. I'm not trying to be dismissive of those things by giving them a relatively small part of this presentation. I think you could easily talk for an hour just on that, right? At the moment, I just want to sort of acknowledge it as an alternative concept of justice. And I mentioned the relational justice before. This is definitely compatible with some of the others. But it's essentially looking at how do we refine our social relationships, not necessarily, but often alongside redistributive forms of justice. So just to kind of elaborate a bit on some of the kind of decolonial critique of some of this stuff, this philosopher Charles Mills is or maybe was a Caribbean philosopher, and he wrote specifically about rules, and in this book, basically sort of saying, look, ultimately, this whole discourse is based on a kind of Western, kind of colonial, Europe is the center of the universe kind of point of view, which essentially dehumanized non-European people. It certainly took a lot from them physically, culturally, spiritually. And I'm quite, aware, and I'm quite germane to this idea of when you're talking about this stuff from a kind of Western philosophical tradition, it can sound a bit like a parlor game or something, which is like, oh, how should we organize society? How should we distribute all the money? Um, and in a way, that is a sort of function of privilege to even be seeing the world that way, where it's just a kind of, almost like a game for you a puzzle for you to solve. And I have some, sympathy for that view. It can be quite frustrating to try and approach philosophy, even as a kind of a Western, someone who trained in philosophy. I experienced similar frustrations with it. I'm not claiming to understand the experiences of people like Charles Mills, but I do think I also want to defend a bit of Western political philosophy and how it kind of feeds through to some of these questions. But I definitely acknowledge it, and I think it's really important. Just another spin on this meme, you could say, well, actually, it's not that we've only got three boxes and three people. One person's got all the boxes, right? And if we're really being authentic with this version of the meme, we might have several hundred people in the kind of reality pit down at the bottom with no boxes. And in a way, this is a more realistic representation of the challenges that we face structurally and economically, trying to achieve some sort of equity between people. Um, so I can see how you might end up being a bit skeptical about some of this stuff. And this recently published article from Nature by someone called Dolores Armenteros, who I don't know, but writes persuasively in this article about how um, they've been trying to do equitable science for a very long time. And they've got to the conclusion that a lot of it is just lip service. A lot of it is just where we need to have some African countries involved in this, or we need some global South people in our project because then we're more likely to get the funding, or um, it would really look good for our institutional optics if we had a bit more equity stuff going on and this kind of stuff. And so you really get a sense of the frustration that she's experiencing through this article, where it's just like there is no true change in equity. There is no change. There is only optics and surface level presentation. But really, you could say you've got inclusion, maybe, you've got diversity, maybe, but you don't have any equity. The equity is the bit that doesn't get shared with you. Um, and I think this is quite persuasive at some levels, right? But what kind of structural change can we as educators hope to bring about? You're talking about really changing the whole of society, and that can be a bit of a daunting thing. And certainly in the work that we've been involved with as GoGN, and also other research projects that we've been involved in, we've certainly been looking in a more optimistic way to try and find ways to act and think more equitably. And I think it is achievable, but then maybe that's easy for me to say, right? Just to try and sort of elaborate some of this a bit, I wrote an article for 23 Good Reasons earlier this year. This was an initiative organized by the European University of Wellbeing. And it was all different things around open education and why you might favor open education, why you might promote it and support it. And so I wrote about equity for this. And essentially, one of the arguments I made, and this is made before I read the Nature article, is to say if you're going to have a truly equitable outcome, there's going to be some redistribution. It can't just be inclusion. It has to involve some sort of structural change, whether that's economic or about practice, curriculum, whatever. And I tried to say in this article, look, openness can be a route to that. It can be a critical lens on existing practice. It can be a helpful thing, but we've got to be wary of a trap, which is assuming that just because we're doing open education, that means it's equitable, because open education need not be equitable. There is a global north, global south divide. There is a digital divide. All these things are real. And we've got to be a little bit careful about our own self-perception as open educators, because there's a trap there, a way of thinking about it. Just to highlight quickly a paper published a couple of years ago where myself and Beck, who's on the call, and some other colleagues from the Open University tried to explore a bit more in a bit more detail this idea of how closely aligned is open education to these kind of forms of emancipatory thinking. And in this case, the focus was decoloniality. It's for a special issue on decolonization. And this just shows you the outcome space from this study. We had 3 case studies, all of them using open educational resources, all of them based at the Open University in the UK, but involving work in other places. So one project in sub-Saharan Africa, one in Kenya, and one in Myanmar. And so we reflected on these, and it's a bit problematic because we didn't have budget or the time to actually go back to any of the people that we'd worked with and get their take on what was going on. So it's a reflective paper from our point of view. But just trying to map across these different concepts and say, well, if you wanted to work towards a genuine sense of equity, of better power relations, can openness be a route to that? And I think it can be a route to that because it's a form of exchange as well as a kind of protocol for how you share stuff and that kind of thing. So I'm less of a skeptic, if you like, than the Nature article, but I recognize that it's hugely difficult and problematic. So I'm just sort of wrapping up this kind of overview now. And essentially, I suppose what I want to say is there are lots of competing ideas about what educational equity is. You can see it as about being about resources. You can see it as about being about outcomes. It could be about cultural change. It could be about the quality of relations between people. And that complexity is part of what, makes this quite hard to navigate sometimes. Obviously, if you take a simpler interpretation, then the whole thing gets a bit simpler. But my point, I guess, is be wary of oversimplifying some of this stuff because it's very, very difficult. And especially when you're getting into the kind of like decolonial framings, the idea of epistemic injustice. And then you have kind of multivalence, right? You've got alternative epistemologies, and reconciling different epistemologies is always going to be a challenge. My feeling is that openness can provide a route to this through sort of supported dialogue and a sense of progressive values and these kind of things. But it's difficult and it's time consuming and it requires attention and reflection. That's enough from me for now, I think. So there's lots of ways into this, and I'm interested to hear from people in the discussion shortly. Before we move to that, I just want to hand over to my colleague, Professor Azuma Dennis from the Open University in the UK, and really interested to hear your perspective on some of these issues. So yeah, please do share with us.
Okay, thank you. You can all hear and see me. Great. I mean, my first comment is to obviously say thanks very much, Rob, for that run through all of those different discussions. And I'm so mindful that I'm not going to be able to do all of those ideas justice. But I will, attempt to give some response, primarily, I think, based on the slides that you sent earlier, or particularly on the meme. But what I will say, when you talked about the multiple things that equity can mean, it seems to me that equity, or certainly decolonisation, which is often where I write and think about more, is not a single project. It really is a multi-headed project, and I really think that there is space and scope and the necessity to be dismantling it from all sorts of fronts. But I did spend a bit of time thinking about the meme and the questions that you posed in relation to it. And of course, it seems to me that there is value in an image, in as much as it's a really useful and helpful summary of what is a complex situation and discussion. It simplifies. And while, some people might say, well, actually, do you know what? Inequality is really not that complicated. It really isn't. Just, stop being racist or stop being sexist and it's sorted, no problem. So perhaps there is a straightforward simplicity to it. I don't know. But nonetheless, a meme doesn't do any kind of a discussion justice. It's a nice illustration, but if we really want to have a discussion about equity, I think you almost have to put it aside and just say, well, it sparks something, but it's got its limitations. I think it does help to frame some questions, and I think that you've done that in what you've actually said. I mean, the ones which caught me the most is, are really all students supposed to focus on the same thing? What if baseball just is not your thing? And I know you had the one with the penguins when they were all looking in different directions, and that seems to capture the situation that we live in. Are the barriers structural? And if we remove them, great, it makes life easier for everyone. But does that actually do anything about inequality? The inequality can still remain. And does the image imply that some inequalities are inevitable? The tallest is always going to be the tallest. And while that's not particularly relevant while they're playing baseball, if they were playing basketball, it would be very relevant. It would be a fundamental thing. So does the meme ignore or imply that? It encourages, but obviously can't possibly answer any of those questions, although perhaps there is an implied answer. Stack the boxes higher for those who need it most. Fair enough. But does it hint of a kind of deficit thinking? That small person really should have just been born taller. Fine, it's not their fault that they weren't born taller, but then it's not mine either. So, why does anybody else have to feel responsible to it? But of course, I'm talking about this meme knowing that there is a limit to what this poor meme can actually do. And so I wanted to then start perhaps thinking about things which are a bit more practical, a bit more everyday, a bit more stuff that is in the real world. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is our APP commitments, so access participation plans, that all universities are compelled to engage with by the Office for Students, to identify where there are inequities for students from minoritized backgrounds, and to set clear goals about goals and strategies about how they're going to address these. And the APP commits the university to achieving, what they consider to be ambitious targets for underrepresented groups, the underrepresentations of Black students, inequitable outcomes for Black students in terms of the awarding gap, for students with mental health difficulties and students on the most deprived background. So these are some of the groups that have been identified. And certainly with the Open University APP plan, there is a target of reducing the awarding gap. It puts in, by this year we want to get it to 12.9%. By this other year we want to get it to 14%, and then eventually we want to get it down to 2.9%. And I always look at that and feel, okay, so you're accepting that some degree of inequality is inevitable, are you? And why would it take you so long? Why would it take us so long to get rid of something that really just shouldn't be here? And then also, again, trying to keep this in a very sort of practical discussion, points me to thinking about there is a higher education race action group, a DISMEL group, which talks about a lot of these things. And one of the things they've talked about quite recently is how race and inequality are talked about in HE. And notably, what all these APP plans is, they talk about it in terms of data. Now, I've been involved in the OU's Race Equality Charter, and I respect absolutely the commitment and integrity of all the colleagues that I've worked with in that Race Equality plan. But this is where, when you begin to look at all these plans and look at all this data, is when, again, going back to that meme, it just feels so simplistic, frustratingly so, that it seems that it really cannot capture the complexity of a situation. Because I think something quite odd happens in institutions when they have these APP plans, these commitments to equity. And I'm thinking about what Sarah Ahmed talks about, sort of an anthropologist, that the plans are there, the commitment is there to reduce the data representations of this inequality, and the potential is there that the inequality they refer to, the data can change, but the inequality they refer to could remain exactly the same as it always was. It could remain untouched. We just want to get good magic numbers. We want them to look good. And she refers, I think, to non-performative spaces. So these are like the institutional speech acts that do not bring about the effect that they name. And in these plans, inequality is represented just as a series of data points, of charts, of graphs, of percentages, statistics. So if we can improve the big magic numbers, the issue is resolved. There's little discussion of actually what sits behind that data. Which, of course, I think is quite worrying and quite frustrating. So if we can improve the data, does this imply that inequalities no longer exist? And where is the discussion that we need to have about what underlies and what sits beneath those inequities? And then in the discussion that I referred to in the GISMEL group, the mood seemed to be that instead of talking about awarding gaps, we might instead talk about debt. And debt, I think, is used in a way in the discussion that's quite deliberately ambiguous. And I'm now sort of bumping into Fred Moten and Stefan Harney. And they compare debt to a brokenness of being. And a brokenness, which they say could also be equated to a blackness that remains a blackness and will, despite everything, remain broken, because we don't have a prescription for repair. And debt is sometimes a history of giving, but it's at other times a history of taking, but it's always a history of capitalism. And debt perhaps signifies the promise of ownership, but it never delivers on that promise. And we have to understand that a debt is something that cannot be paid off. And actually, we look, well, do we want it to be paid off? Do we want recognition and acknowledgement from a system that denies anything that was ever broken and accepts that we deserved to be the broken part? So perhaps we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we just want to take it apart, to dismantle it, to tear it down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really powerful stuff, and I totally what you're saying about the idea to kind of turn this into a set of metrics really resonates because that is how it is done in a lot of places, and there's nothing relational about it. It is just does the number look like the number that we want or not? And that's I think how it's handled in a lot of places. I just want to open it up a little bit more for discussion now with the wider group, if that's okay.
Can, can I
Oh
just
yeah,
make
please finish your point though.
one
Oh, yeah.
statement, and fine, it leaps all over the place. It really it does, and I appreciate it does. But I kind of like the statement that they talk about that they don't want to end racism or inequity or colonialism, but they want to end the standpoint from which those things make sense. Um, and so it's not about speaking truth to power, but it's perhaps acknowledging that you have to inhabit a space that is nonsensical, that's ranting, that's crazy, and that is other, and that the other has been rendered a non-entity by those inequities.
Thank you. Do we have other people on the panel who would like to come in at this point and maybe make a contribution? Antonio?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Azumas and Rob. This has been truly enlightening. I want to bring some critique here to encourage debate. I was thinking about myself in my role of educator, being part of the committees or group of people who are teaching and delivering the so-called curriculum, yeah? And we decide what to teach. We decide how to teach it, how to assess it. Yeah, but then we also have in mind all these considerations about bringing equity to our students in our education, the education that we try to deliver. Yeah. So we find a lot of obstacles. Our world is highly regulated. We have a specific number of sessions that we have to cover, but we can't cover more. We have a number of students in the classroom. We have a lot of processes. When it comes to deciding what to assess, a lot of people come in with quality assurance considerations, etc., etc. It's a very difficult job to actually try to implement any of these very good ideas, into the day-to-day operations. We think about universities' plans and policies and big operations in terms of institutional buyout for this very legitimate cause. But in the day-to-day operations, this is so awkward. So my contribution would be the following: equity is a journey. And sometimes we risk being truly inconsistent from a philosophical point of view, because trying to fight for that equity means trying to promote certain solutions that may come from one approach or from another. This is a mixture of approaches. Sometimes you see yourself defending a specific measure because you think that's the one that you can get, even though it may not fit in completely with the principles that you are defending. So reality is very messy and equity is a journey. And I really enjoyed everything here today and the contributions as well of the colleagues in the chat. Thank you, Azuma, and thank you, Rob.
Thank you. And we're coming up on the hour, but I think we can go for a bit longer if people want to be part of the discussion. Do we have anyone else who'd like to come in?
I think this comment's made by Maha Bali
Oh, yeah.
is interesting. Though she or she, I'll settle on she, doesn't want to speak to Mike, I don't think.
If I stop sharing my screen, I can see the chat, so I'll do that.
Okay. I think the discussion is missing the care element, and Tronto's work, especially as a philosopher who talks about the importance of social justice and care together. Also, people like Bell Hooks bring that up.
I would agree with that. And in a way, some of this philosophical stuff can be a bit bloodless, right? It's a bit abstract and a bit, far removed from the reality of existing, right? So I totally recognize that. And these things are compatible with a care perspective, I would say. It's not that they exclude them, but they don't prioritize them. And that's by design, right? So a lot of the philosophy stuff is about making it as rational as possible. You can debate what rational means and whether it's a helpful approach in the first place. But if you were to base the entire system on how much someone cared, that would be a hard thing to think through potentially as well. So any other questions or comments that we should highlight? See, there's a few familiar names here in the chat. Hello, everyone. Chrissy, please do jump in.
Thank you so much, Rob. I always find it fascinating, you know that, listening to you talking and listening to philosophical perspectives. I'm obviously not an expert in any shape or form. I know a few philosophers from ancient Greek, but beyond that, I have a lot of catch up to do. But I think the way you presented equity, I could see it as an onion with different layers, if you like, to bring in a different metaphor. And for me, what stood out is what Maha also highlighted, that relational aspect to actually live equity, or I don't know if we can say give equity, be equitable with others that are in group but also out of group. And I think that is where the issue for me lies, but also the opportunities and the need for change. And I'm thinking, how can we as open educators, open scholars, actually make a significant contribution to that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. I mean, in a way, that's the kind of key question. And it might be that actually it's more to do with relationality and care and cultural change than the formal education bit, right? Maybe that's the smaller part of this puzzle, because a lot of the issues can be understood as about relationality, about care, about those things. And I think one of the things that I've tried to point to was the inadequacy of this idea of just redistributing stuff. But we need that bit as well. It can't just be we just talk about things and change our feelings, because some of these things are about structural inequalities and they are economic realities. And, we need to not lose sight of that as well. So I think we should probably wrap up pretty soon. Was there anyone else who wanted to come in? I'm happy to give you the last word, Azuma, if you would like, if there's something you would like to finish.
Thank you for the invite. I do think that comment about the care and connection is important, and certainly in reading about the work she brought in bell hooks, much of this is about removing the barriers to relationships and engagement and being able to get at each other because of these structures that imply we are different, we are distinct, we are unable.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for coming along today. Really appreciate you taking the time. I hope you will join us all for the rest of the series. Details are on the Knowledge Equity Network website. And we'll hope to see you later on in the series. But we'll sign off for today. Thanks everyone for coming along. Thank you, Azuma, for your contributions. Appreciate it. And yeah, have a good rest of the day. Have a good evening wherever you are. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.